Hello there, everyone. My name is Jimmy Mack, and welcome back to the 8th Academic Podcast. This is going to be the NS2 textbook Maritime History, Chapter 1, Influence of Sea Power on Western Civilization. Now, this chapter is just going to be a whole bunch of ancient history, primarily European and Western history, because this is a very Eurocentric textbook, which is a bit questionable, but it gets us points, so let's get right into it. Now, first off, way back in the beginnings of things, people really were scared of the seas because drowning is a problem that you have to deal with. They basically saw them as big barriers. The first people of Europe that were able to master the seas were the Cretans, who used them for both trade and warfare, and they basically dominated the region that they are in. They're on a massive island south of Greece, which is a good reason to get good at sailing. Being on an island completely surrounded by water. Anyway, next up were the Phoenicians, centered in Lebanon, who also managed to just really take control of everything they really wanted. It was pretty great for them. The next civilization we need to talk about is the Greeks, who did a whole bunch of seafaring, warfare, trade, etc., which makes sense since they're centered pretty squarely on the Mediterranean. First thing we need to talk about is the Trojan War. Which most of what we know about the Trojan War, what with the horse and all that, comes from the Iliad by Homer, which is fiction, but it was based on some actual conflicts around 1200 BC to control the Dardanelles, or what was called the Hellespont, and they basically gained control of trade in the region. Now, the next people we need to talk about are the Persians, but we need to talk about them because they went up against the Greeks. Those were two big powers at the time, and the Persians were led by Xerxes, and in around 480 BC, there was a huge invasion by Xerxes to try and conquer the Greeks once and for all, and so they were invading from the east. And so he built a navy of 1,300 galleys, which is, by the way, a special ship full of trained fighting men. So they have this massive fleet, and it's following his 180,000-man army, and they're basically just gonna come in and wreck the place. And so Themistocles, who's the Greek commander, is basically like, oh no, I've got a problem. But what he does is he focuses on sea lines of communication, which are basically how you get stuff from place to place and do logistics over the sea. And so he builds a naval force of triremes, which is the cool Greek ship. That's what you need to think of when you hear trireme. And there's a whole bunch of dramatic stuff that goes on in the book, but that's not really important. What you need to know is he wins. And Greece was decidedly unconquered. The Greeks primarily won this battle because of their advanced maneuverability that the Persians just didn't have, combined with the fact that they tactically chose to have that battle around the Straits of Salamis, where there was bad weather and some rocks that you could get wrecked on, and generally the Persians just didn't have a good time because of all that. Now, after they kicked the Persians' collective butts, the Greeks went on to have a pretty good time in the Golden Age of Athens, and then they had Alexander the Great, who I hear was a pretty swell fellow, and then eventually they kind of declined. Yeah. Anyway, as the Greeks were doing their Greek thing, we've got another nation coming up, and their name is Rome, and they're like, we really like power, why don't we expand across almost the entire Mediterranean? However, they ran into a problem by the name of Carthage, who had already pretty much blocked Greek expansion, and they're like, we don't like these guys. So they have a whole bunch of wars. These are called the Punic Wars, which happened in Sicily. The reason they're called the Punic Wars is not actually because they have to deal with punishment, but rather because it's the word Punic is a Latin variant on Phoenician. Now, Rome had been studying Greek naval tactics before this because, if you're going to study from someone, might as well be the guys that kicked people's collective butts. So they won all of the Punic Wars. The first Punic War, they captured Sicily. Second Punic War, they captured Spain. And then the third Punic War, they burnt all of Carthage to the ground, and it never returned. And so Rome was on their way to have a pretty good time. And by have a pretty good time, I mean enter the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, which was the longest period of peace in all of world history, because Rome just controlled everything and no one was really bothering them. And so they had a whole bunch of cultural flourishing, and they also took control of the entire Mediterranean, and so they started calling it Mare Nostrum, or Our Sea, which is kind of just a flex. Now, eventually, Rome falls, spoiler alert, and we enter the Dark Ages because everything kind of sucked then. And then we've got the Vikings from up in Scandinavia, who do a whole bunch of plundering and exploration and really all that good stuff. And they're using these wooden sailing vessels called longships. And so they basically just sail into places, wreck house, and then sail right back out. And they do a whole bunch of stuff that no one really cares about. And then we move on to the Crusades. So, at this point, the Roman Empire has been split into the Byzantine Empire, but Constantinople has not yet been captured and turned into Istanbul. However, the Jerusalem, the holy land of Christianity, and also Islam, is currently in the hands of Muslims. So, what are the Christians going to do? Launch a holy war, of course, which is the First Crusade, where they recaptured Jerusalem, which lasted a really long time, by which I mean not very long at all. It got captured back again later. There were a whole bunch more crusades that no one really cared about. And then we stopped crusading because we realized it was kind of a bad idea because we kept losing them, like, a lot. However, the religious fervor that spawned them also boosted a whole bunch of European economies. In particular, Italy, who gained a whole bunch of land through primarily economic means. And then they had the Renaissance because they were like, hey, remember those Greeks? They were pretty cool, don't you think? Yeah, I think they were pretty cool. And so the Renaissance was a thing where they studied a whole bunch of Greek classics and did a whole bunch of cool cultural development and yada, yada, yada. So that was pretty cool. Meanwhile, the main Muslim power on the world is now the Ottoman Turks, who sweep across the Dardanelles and capture Constantinople, and now the Byzantine Empire falls, which is kind of sad for the Byzantine Empire, but it's great for the Ottoman Turks. Now, as you can imagine, the Ottoman Turks, being a humongous world power, does not really sit well with all the Christians, so eventually Spain and Italy in like 1570 are like, okay, fine, we'll put aside our differences, we're gonna go kick those Turks' butts. So they join forces, and they make a massive fleet of like 200 galleys. However, the Ottoman fleet has 250, so they've got a whole bunch more of them. However, the Turks' main weapons are still the bow and arrow at range, whereas the Christians have the arquebus, Alpha Romeo Quebec Uniform Echo Bravo Uniform Sierra, which is an early type of musket. And as you can imagine, bringing a gun to a bow and arrow fight is rather effective. And so they have a ship battle at the Gulf of Lepanto near Greece. And, so they kicked a whole bunch of Turkish butt, and as a result of this, the Ottoman Turks couldn't really expand any further along the Mediterranean, and as well, this signaled the end of the age where galleys were an important force in figuring out who's going to win a battle, because of a massive advance of technology. This end of the age of the galley leads us to the age of discovery. This is where we see all this, like, exploration, conquistador, conquering type New World stuff that we've got going on in, like, the late 1400s, early 1500s, all that stuff going on. In particular, we've got mercantile theory, or mercantilism, which is how European nations were making money off of all of the colonizing that they were doing during this area, where basically you just make a whole bunch of colonies, get them to send you back gold and silver, and just let yourself profit from it. So that was what was going on around that time. Now, a whole bunch of drama starts going down in Europe. First off, we've got Pope Pius V, who tells King Philip II of Spain to do two things. First, get the Muslims out of Europe, and second, crusade against the heretic and usurper Queen Elizabeth I. By the way, that heretic and usurper part was a quote. I don't have too much against Queen Elizabeth I. He sets himself out to do this task. Elizabeth, on the other hand, is like, hold on, I need to protect my power. I like power. So what she starts doing is allowing seamen to raid treasure ships and just basically sanctioning piracy, which is called privateering. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on with that. But now with a whole bunch of English raids going on Spanish ships, Spain's pretty pissed about that, so King Philip sends forth a massive armada. This is the famed Spanish Armada, and he's like, yep, this is definitely unbeatable. And so basically he was just trying to stop all the raiding and stuff. He had 124 galleons with 1,100 guns. There were just an incredible amount of stuff, And opposing it, we have the English with 34 men of war, 163 armed merchantmen, a whole bunch more just regular soldiers, and 2,000 guns, which is a lot more guns, but a lot less ships. So we've got these massive armies going up against each other. The Armada has a whole bunch of galleons, where the English has smaller ships, and they also have culverins, which is a lot longer range cannon. King Philip, the Spanish king, orders his soldiers to grapple and board and engage hand to hand. A grapple being a massive metal hook, similar to a grappling hook. So they're trying to board the English, but the English are trying to fight with guns because they have the advantage over range, and they don't have as many soldiers. Now, at the outset of this battle, it looks like England is going to win, right? Because the English ships are keeping a massive distance between them because their guns are effective at range, while the Spanish ships are having a really tough time of it because their guns aren't so effective at range, their plans to board. But both of their supply ships are ineffective. The Spanish Armada quickly runs out of all of their heavy shot. The English is also running out of ammunition. They run out a lot later. So, while the English people still have ammunition, they send fire ships, which are ships loaded up with combustibles that were set on fire and sent drifting into enemy ships. And so they did a whole bunch of confusion tactics that way. And by the time the English ran out of ammunition, the Spanish were already on the run. So they basically were trying to flee around Britain and Ireland and return home. Now, if the British had enough stuff to keep fighting, they probably could have killed them then and there, but as it was, it ended up just being hunger, thirst, and a general lack of supplies that ended up killing the Spanish Armada. Most of them sank. Only about half of the force made it back, and so that failure of the Spanish Armada to stop the English fleet started Spain's decline. So England, France, and the Netherlands all started out doing a lot more colonizing and stuff like that because of this. And there are a whole bunch of pirates and privateers plundering the Spanish Main, which is a whole bunch of colonies that Spain still had because they realized, hey, hold on, Spain's pretty weak. They can't really do much about it. And so with Spain, England's main rival, out of the way, they're free to do a whole bunch of colonizing and imperialism and start what we now know to be the British Empire. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Thank you all so much for listening, and I'll see you tomorrow.